Overweight 500lb woman whispered, "It hurts to be touched." Only one man had the courage to listen. The sun over Redemption Creek was a merciless white eye in a bleached blue sky. It baked the very soul of the town, cracking the earth of the main street into a mosaic of thirst and turning the air into a shimmering, breathable heat. It was the kind of day that drove sensible folk indoors, behind drawn curtains and sweating glasses of water. But for Abigail, there was no choice. The supplies in her larder had dwindled to almost nothing, and the solitude of her family's old farm, which had once been a comforting shield, had become a cage of hunger. Her journey into town was a pilgrimage of shame. The old wagon, its wood groaning under her weight, felt like a public stage. She hadn't been seen in Redemption Creek for nearly 5 months, and she could feel the change in the atmosphere as she passed the first storefronts. It began with a silence, a sudden halt in conversation as heads turned. Then came the stares, eyes like flint, a mixture of morbid curiosity and undisguised contempt. Finally, the whispers started, quiet and venomous, like tiny, sharp stones thrown from the shadows of doorways. "Look at the state of her, a disgrace to her father's good name. Lord have mercy, has she no shame at all?" Abigail kept her eyes fixed forward on the faded sign of Miller's Mercantile. Her hands, clutching the reins, were slick with sweat. Every labored breath she took felt like an apology for existing. Her dress, made of a heavy, dark cotton, clung to her uncomfortably, a constant reminder of the body that had become her prison. She was a landmark of sorrow, a living testament to some private, unspoken tragedy the townspeople could only guess at, and they judged her for it with the casual cruelty of the self-righteous. She finally pulled the wagon to a halt, the old horse sighing with relief. The simple act of climbing down was an ordeal. She had to shift her immense weight carefully, her joints aching in protest, her heart hammering against her ribs, not just from the effort, but from the wall of eyes that followed her every move. She could see Sheriff Brody leaning against a post outside his office, tipping his hat down to hide his gaze, but not his judgment. She saw Mrs. Gable, the pastor's wife, purse her lips in a look of pious disapproval from across the street. Her foot touched the ground. For a moment she felt a wave of dizziness, the heat and humiliation churning inside her. The world tilted, the sharp edges of the buildings blurring into a hazy mirage. The whispers seemed to grow louder, coalescing into a dull roar in her ears. She took a single unsteady step toward the Mercantile, her vision swimming. The sun beat down, a physical weight on her head and shoulders. The ground, once so solid, seemed to rush up to meet her. There was a collective gasp from the onlookers as she fell. It was not a delicate stumble, but a heavy, earth-shaking collapse. The sound was a dull, heavy thud that momentarily silenced the entire street. Dust billowed up around her, settling on her dark dress like a shroud. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. The world was frozen. People stared, paralyzed by a mixture of shock and an unwillingness to get involved. Sheriff Brody took a half-step forward, then stopped, unsure of what to do. It was a spectacle of human frailty, and no one wanted to touch it. Then a sound cut through the silence. The rhythmic, powerful clang, clang, clang from the blacksmith's forge at the end of the street went silent. From the fiery glow of the forge emerged a figure, Silas. He was a man carved from the same rugged material as the mountains that loomed over the town. His shoulders were broad, his arms thick with the muscle of his trade, and his face was a quiet map of hard work and unspoken history. Wiping his hands on a leather apron, he walked with a purpose that was entirely absent in the rest of the gawking crowd. He didn't look at anyone else. His eyes were fixed only on the woman lying in the dust. He crossed the street, his heavy boots making soft thuds in the dirt. The crowd parted for him, a silent acknowledgement of a strength they did not possess. He knelt beside Abigail, his large frame creating a protective wall between her and the prying eyes of the town. He said nothing. He simply assessed the situation with a calm, quiet focus. Gently, he reached out. his calloused but surprisingly steady hand moving to touch her arm, intending to help her sit up. It was then that she moved. It wasn't a conscious act, but a deep, instinctual recoil. She flinched away from his touch as if his hand were a hot iron. Her eyes, clouded with pain and shame, fluttered open and met his. A sound, barely a breath, escaped her lips. It was a whisper, so fragile it was nearly lost in the oppressive heat. "It hurts," she rasped, her voice thick with a pain that went far beyond the physical. "It hurts to be touched." Silas heard it. Every broken syllable registered in his quiet gaze. He did not ask why. He did not insist. He simply listened, and with a level of understanding that stunned the silent onlookers, he slowly drew his hand back. He did not leave. He remained kneeling beside her, a silent, solitary guardian in a street full of judges, a man who had the courage not to act, but to listen. The world held its breath. Abigail's whispered words, "It hurts to be touched," hung in the dead air, a confession of a pain deeper than any physical ailment. Silas, still kneeling, absorbed the truth of them. His gaze, clear and steady, held no pity, only a quiet acknowledgement. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a silent promise that he understood. Without another glance at the gawking townsfolk, he rose to his full height. His movements were economical and sure. He walked not to his forge, but to the water trough outside the sheriff's office. He took the communal tin dipper, rinsed it twice with a steady hand, and filled it with cool, clean water. The crowd watched, their whispers finally dying into a confused silence. This was an act they didn't understand. It was simple, direct, and devoid of drama. He returned to Abigail's side and knelt once more. He didn't try to help her up. He simply held the dipper out to her. His silence was a question, an offering without demand. Abigail stared at the water, then at his calloused hand, then into his eyes. She saw no judgment there, only patience. After a long moment, her trembling hand reached out and took the dipper. The water was a blessing on her parched throat. When she finished, he took the dipper back. His eyes then fell upon the front wheel of her wagon, which was canted at an unnatural angle. The iron rim had partially slipped off. Without a word, he walked to the wagon. He braced his shoulder against the heavy wood, his muscles cording as he lifted just enough to relieve the pressure. With his other hand and a small tool from his apron, he expertly worked the iron band back into its groove, his movements practiced and efficient. A few solid, resounding taps with the heel of his hand, and the wheel was secure. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his apron again. He had offered water for her thirst and strength for her journey. He had not spoken a single word to her since she fell. He simply turned and walked back toward the red glow of his forge, leaving Abigail to gather her dignity in the quiet space his actions had created. As Silas stoked the coals in his forge, the heat a familiar comfort, a shadow fell across the entrance. It was Mrs. Gable, the pastor's wife, her hands clasped in front of her as if holding a prayer book. Her smile was thin, a brittle mask for her disapproval. "Mr. Silas," she began, her voice sweet as honey laced with arsenic. "That was a Christian act, I suppose, but we must be careful not to encourage certain behaviors. Laziness and gluttony are sins, you know. The good Lord helps those who help themselves." Silas didn't turn. He placed a bar of iron into the fire, his focus absolute. "The Lord also said to give a cup of cold water to the thirsty, Mrs. Gable." His voice was low and even, the sound of gravel rolling downhill. "Of course," she pressed on, undeterred. "But enabling her isolation does the woman no favors. She is a blight on this town's moral character. She needs prayer and repentance, not repairs." Silas finally turned, his eyes meeting hers. He said nothing. He simply held her gaze, his silence a wall of integrity she could not breach. Flustered, Mrs. Gable offered a tight nod and swept away, her mission of righteous meddling a failure. Miles away at the farm, Abigail bolted the door. The memory of the town's eyes on her was a fresh wound. It brought back other memories, other pains. She sank into a chair, the wood groaning in protest. She remembered a younger man, a handsome suitor named James, promising her the world. She remembered the day he saw her eat a second slice of cake at the town picnic, the look of disgust that flickered across his face. He left town a week later. She remembered her father's funeral, how the weight of grief settled on her, and how food became the only comfort that never judged, never left. Each layer of fat was another brick in the wall she built to protect a heart that had been broken too many times. The cruelty of Mrs. Gable was just an echo of a pain she already knew intimately. The next morning, the sun rose on a world washed clean. Silas saddled his horse, not for a trip to the mountains for ore, but on the quiet road that led out of town. He rode with a steady, unhurried pace toward the old farmstead that rested under the shadow of the cottonwood trees. He had noticed something else yesterday, something beyond the broken wagon wheel. He didn't ride up to the front door. He dismounted at the property line and approached on foot, his tool belt now fastened over his trousers. The farm had an air of neglect. Weeds grew high, and the paint on the house was peeling like sunburnt skin. On the porch, the bottom step was cracked clean through, a treacherous trap for anyone, let alone a woman of Abigail's size. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. To do so would be to demand her attention, to force an interaction she was not ready for. Instead, he treated the house as his client. He knelt, examined the rot, and set to work. From inside, Abigail heard the sound of a saw. Fear, sharp and cold, shot through her. She crept to the window, peering through a gap in the dusty curtains. She saw him, the blacksmith, working on her porch. He was not looking at the house. His entire focus was on the wood in his hands. He measured, he sawed, he hammered. His movements were filled with a quiet competence that was deeply calming. She watched, frozen, as he removed the broken plank and fitted a new, sturdy one in its place. He tested it with his full weight, ensuring its strength. Then he gathered his tools, cleaned up the wood shavings and left. He simply walked back to his horse and rode away. He had repaired a piece of her broken world and asked for nothing in return, not even an acknowledgement. For the first time in years, Abigail felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was a fragile, unfamiliar warmth, gratitude. A new, silent ritual began. Every few days, Silas would ride out to the edge of Abigail's property. He'd leave something on the sturdy porch step he'd repaired. One day, it was a loaf of bread, still warm from the baker's oven. Another day, a small crate of fresh vegetables from his own garden, tomatoes, squash, and potatoes. He never lingered. He would place the offering down, nod once toward the silent house, and leave. For Abigail, each gift was a battle. Her first instinct was to hide, to pretend she hadn't seen it, to let it rot on the porch. Accepting it felt like accepting a connection, and connection was the source of all her pain. But the smell of the fresh bread was too good to ignore. The vibrant colors of the vegetables were a stark contrast to the blandness of her life. Hesitantly, she would open the door, her heart pounding, and quickly bring the items inside. Each meal was a taste of a kindness she thought had vanished from the world. One sweltering afternoon, she spent hours squeezing the last of her lemons and using the sugar she had bought on that fateful day in town. She made a large pitcher of lemonade, chilled it in the cool depths of her well, and poured it into a clean glass jar. With trembling hands, she placed the jar on the porch step, where his gifts always appeared. She then retreated behind her window, her breath held tight in her chest. Silas arrived on schedule. He dismounted and saw the jar immediately. He stopped. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. He picked up the jar, unscrewed the lid, and drank the lemonade, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. When he was done, he placed the empty jar back on the step, gave a deliberate, respectful nod toward the window he knew she was behind, and rode away. No words had been spoken, but a conversation had taken place. Silas didn't always go straight home from the forge. Sometimes he took the path that led to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Redemption Creek. There, under a weathered oak tree, was a simple headstone: Eleanor, beloved wife, at peace. He would stand before the grave, his hat in his hands, the silence between them as familiar as her smile had once been. He wasn't a man for many words, even in prayer. His communion was one of memory. He remembered Eleanor in her final years, her body wasting away from a sickness the doctor had no name for. He remembered her vibrant spirit becoming trapped in a frail, painful shell. He, Silas, a man who could bend iron to his will, had been utterly helpless. He could bring her broth, hold her hand, and watch the light in her eyes dim. His strength, his defining quality, had been useless against her pain. The feeling of that powerlessness had settled deep in his bones, a quiet ache that never truly left him. He had failed to protect the person he loved most from a foe he could not see or fight. That was why he helped Abigail. He saw in her a different kind of imprisonment, a different kind of pain. He saw a soul barricaded against the world, just as Eleanor's had been barricaded by her illness. Fixing Abigail's wagon wheel, her porch step, leaving her food, these were things he could do. They were small acts of defiance against the helplessness that haunted him. It wasn't pity that drove him. It was a deep, personal need to mend what was broken, to shield what was vulnerable. In protecting Abigail from the town's cruelty, he was, in a small way, fighting the ghosts of his own past, proving to himself that his strength could still mean something in a world full of hurt. The sky had been a bruised purple all afternoon. That evening, the storm broke over Redemption Creek with a terrible fury. Rain came down in blinding sheets, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. In her farmhouse, Abigail listened to the storm rage, the house groaning around her. The night was long and violent, but it was the silence in the aftermath that was most unsettling. The next morning, she saw the devastation. A huge section of her barn roof had been torn away, leaving the hayloft and its contents exposed to the elements. The damage was catastrophic. It would take more money than she had and more strength than she could ever muster to fix it. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. Her despair was a scent on the wind, and it attracted a predator. By midday, a slick black buggy pulled up to her farm. It was Mr. Finch, the town banker, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He stepped out, tutting at the damaged roof, with false sympathy. "My dear Abigail," he said, approaching the porch but keeping a careful distance. "A terrible tragedy, truly. A woman in your condition cannot possibly manage a crisis like this. The land is becoming a burden to you." Abigail stood in the doorway, a sentinel at the gate of her ruin. Finch continued, his voice smooth as oil. "I am prepared to make you a generous offer, enough to relocate to a small room in the city where you can be looked after. It would be a mercy, really. Allow me to take this heavy weight off your shoulders." He named a price that was a fraction of the land's true value, an insult disguised as an act of charity. He saw not a woman in pain, but an opportunity for profit. Abigail felt the walls closing in, the wind knocked out of her. Just as Mr. Finch's predatory smile widened, the sound of a lone horse cut through the tense air. Both he and Abigail turned. It was Silas, riding toward them with a grim set to his jaw. He had seen the damage to the barn from the main road and had come at once. He dismounted, his presence immediately shifting the balance of power. His boots made a heavy, deliberate sound on the dirt as he walked to the porch, placing himself between the banker and Abigail's door. He didn't look at Finch at first. He looked at Abigail, a silent question in his eyes, asking if she was all right. "Well, Silas," Finch said with a dismissive chuckle, "come to offer your condolences? I was just helping Miss Abigail with a business matter." Silas slowly turned his head, his gaze as hard and unyielding as the anvil in his forge. For the first time since that day in town, he spoke with a voice that was not quiet, but resonant with cold, clear authority. "The farm is not for sale, Finch." The banker's smile faltered. "That is for the lady to decide. This is no concern of yours." "You are trespassing on her land," Silas stated, his voice dropping lower, each word a heavy hammer blow. "And you are wrong. It is my concern." He took a small step forward, and the banker instinctively took one back. Then, looking past Finch to the town in the distance, Silas raised his voice so it carried. "This barn will be repaired. I'm calling a mutiram. The good men of this town will see to it." He turned his gaze back to Finch, a silent challenge. "She is not alone." Finch stared, momentarily speechless. He saw the iron resolve in Silas's eyes and knew there was no deal to be made here. The easy prey was now protected by a force he could not bully or buy. With a frustrated sneer, the banker turned on his heel, climbed into his buggy, and rode away in a cloud of dust and defeat. The dawn that followed the storm broke with a fragile, pearlescent light, but for Abigail it illuminated only the stark reality of her ruin. She stood at her kitchen window, a cup of chicory held forgotten in her hands, her gaze fixed on the wounded barn. Silas's words from the day before echoed in her mind. "She is not alone." A promise so bold and beautiful it felt like a dream. But Abigail was a student of harsh awakenings. Her life had taught her that promises were brittle things, easily broken by the morning sun. The town's silence had been her most constant companion, its judgment, her daily bread. Why would today be any different? She watched the long, empty road leading from town, her heart a heavy, leaden thing in her chest. She steeled herself for the inevitable disappointment, layering it over her hope like a protective shroud. An hour bled into the next. The sun climbed higher, and the road remained empty. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was accusatory. It confirmed what she'd always known. She was, and always would be, alone. Just as a tear of resignation began to trace a path through the dust on the windowpane, her breath caught. A flicker of movement, not a trick of the heat, but a slow, deliberate shape materializing in the distance. It was a simple farm wagon, its progress steady and unassuming. As it drew closer, she recognized Jedediah, a man whose face was as weathered as his land, a man who hadn't spoken more than 3 words to her in 20 years. He wasn't a friend, not an enemy. He was simply part of the town's silent, watchful landscape. He pulled his wagon to a stop, the quiet creak of the wheels a thunderclap in the stillness. He climbed down, his movements stiff but sure, and retrieved a hammer and a saw. Without a single glance toward the house, he walked to the barn and stood before the gaping hole in its roof, his head tilted as if contemplating an opponent. He had come to work. Abigail's heart stuttered. It was a single drop of rain in a vast desert, but it was real. Before she could fully process it, another figure appeared, this one on foot. It was young Tom from the livery, his shoulders slumped as if carrying a weight. He had been there that day in the street, one of the jeering, silent faces in the crowd. He approached Jedediah, his face a mask of shame and resolve, and mumbled a few words. Jedediah simply grunted and pointed with his hammer toward the damaged rafters. A few minutes later, 2 more men, the Johnson brothers who ran a small freight business, arrived in their own wagon. By mid-morning, a small, determined crew was assembled. It was a strange gathering, not the town's pious elite, but its quiet, calloused soul. And then came Silas. His wagon was loaded high with fresh-cut pine beams, the scent of sawdust, a clean, hopeful smell on the air. He surveyed the scene, his gaze acknowledging each man with a nod of profound, unspoken respect. No grand speech was needed. The purpose was clear, written on the faces of these men who had chosen action over judgment. The air, once thick with lonely silence, now sang with the music of restoration. The sharp, rhythmic retort of hammers, the steady rasp of saws, the low grunts of men lifting heavy timber. It was a symphony of quiet honor. From her porch across the way, Abigail could see Mrs. Gable watching, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of disbelief and impotent fury. Her currency of shame was worthless here. Inside the farmhouse, Abigail trembled. Every hammer blow seemed to land directly on the fortress she had built around her heart, cracking the mortar of her isolation. She could stay hidden. It was her habit, her shield. But as she watched Silas effortlessly hoist a massive beam into place, his strength a tangible form of kindness, she knew that hiding was no longer an option. This was not charity to be passively received. It was a connection being offered, a hand reaching out through the darkness. With a resolve that felt foreign and exhilarating, she marched to her pantry. She drew a bucket of cool, clear water from the well and filled a large ceramic pitcher. Her hands, which had trembled with fear for so long, were now steady with purpose. Carrying the pitcher and a stack of tin cups, she pushed open her front door and stepped out into the full, brilliant light of day. The sounds of work ceased instantly. One by one, the men turned, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. They looked at her, and for the first time, she did not flinch. In their eyes, she saw not contempt, not pity, but a simple, profound respect for the mistress of the house. She walked down the steps, the solid, dependable steps Silas had built, and approached the worksite. Her voice, when she spoke, was raspy from disuse, but carried across the quiet yard. "You must be tired, thirsty," she said, her gaze steady. She held out the pitcher. Thank you all." Old Jedediah, his face unreadable, was the first to step forward. He took a cup, filled it to the brim, and drained it in one long swallow. He met her eyes and gave a single, curt nod that spoke volumes. The other men followed, each taking a cup, their gruff thanks a balm on her wounded spirit. She was no longer a spectacle. She was a neighbor. In the middle of her own broken-down farm, surrounded by the rubble of a storm, Abigail finally, truly, felt like she had come home. The barn was whole again. As the sun bled its final golden-red hues across the horizon on the second day, the men packed their tools. A quiet satisfaction hung in the air, thicker than the scent of fresh-cut wood. They departed as they had arrived, without fanfare, leaving behind not just a repaired structure, but a restored sense of place in the world for the woman who lived within it. The ensuing days passed in a gentle cadence that Abigail had only known in childhood memories. The silence of the farm was no longer a suffocating blanket of loneliness, but a peaceful space for thought. She found herself tending to the small, overgrown garden her mother had once loved, her hands in the soil, feeling a connection to the earth that was grounding and real. One afternoon, a week later, she saw Silas's wagon on the road. It didn't stop at the edge of the property this time. It rolled steadily up the lane and came to a halt right in front of the porch. Her heart gave a little flutter, not of fear, but of pleasant curiosity. He was not just a silent benefactor anymore. He was a visitor. He swung himself down and went to the back of the wagon. With great care, he unloaded an object that made Abigail's breath catch in her throat. It was a rocking chair, crafted from a deep, lustrous oak, but it was the chair's dimensions that held her captive. It was magnificent in its proportions, wide, deep, and built with thick, strong arms and legs that spoke of unyielding support. It was not a piece of furniture made for an average person. It was a throne built with an artisan's skill and a friend's understanding. Silas hadn't just built her a chair. He had seen her, truly seen her, and crafted a space where she could rest without apology. It was the most profound act of acceptance she had ever known. He carried it onto the porch as if it weighed nothing and placed it in the perfect spot to catch the afternoon sun. Then, to her surprise, he returned to the wagon and retrieved a second chair, slightly smaller but of the same handsome design, and placed it right beside the first. It was not a gift to be enjoyed in solitude. It was an invitation. Drawn by an irresistible pull, Abigail came out onto the porch. She stood before the chair, running a hand over the smooth, sanded wood. Words failed her. She looked at Silas, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and he simply smiled a small, gentle smile and gestured toward it. She lowered herself into the seat. There was no groan of protesting wood, no precarious wobble. The chair received her, held her, cradled her in a solid, secure embrace. It fit. She pushed off gently with her foot, and the chair began a slow, rhythmic rock, a motion as comforting as a lullaby. For the first time she could remember, she felt not heavy, but anchored. Silas sat in the chair beside her, and a companionable silence settled between them, a quiet so full of meaning it felt more intimate than any conversation. They rocked in unison, watching the shadows lengthen across the yard and listening to the first crickets begin their evening song. The world seemed to slow down, to breathe with them. The pain that had defined her for so long, the sting of a touch, the wound of a stare, felt distant and faded, a ghost from another life. After a long while Silas spoke, his voice a low rumble that blended with the evening's peace. "It's a good day," he said, his gaze on the horizon. Abigail turned to him, her face illuminated by the soft twilight. The smile that bloomed there was radiant, free of the sorrow that had clouded it for years. She thought of the journey, the fall in the dust, the whisper of pain, the cup of water, the broken step, the bread on her doorstep, the roof over her head. He had mended her world without ever laying a hand on her. He had healed the wound of "it hurts to be touched" with a presence that respected her boundaries completely. The great oppressive weight of her shame had finally been lifted, replaced by the profound grounding weight of a kindness so immense it had reshaped her soul. "Yes, it is," she replied, her voice soft but sure, filled with a nascent joy, as sturdy and reliable as the oak chair holding her. "It truly is." This story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful acts of kindness are the ones that happen in silence, and true strength is the courage to see the person everyone else ignores. We believe one decent soul can inspire a whole community to be better. What moment in Silas and Abigail's story resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you cherish stories that honor faith and human goodness, please subscribe for more tales from our channel.